Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us at the Li Kai-shing Knowledge Institute's Clinical and Population Rounds, and the fourth talk in the series on ending the practice of race correction in medicine. For more information on the topics we've covered in the series, such as how race correction shows up in kidney care or how the scientific myths that are foundational to the practice of race correction are still taught in medical school, including here in Canada, you can find this information at our website for this series, and the links include recordings of past talks. The organizing of these talks is a team effort, and I want to acknowledge my teammates, Amy Katz, Lana James, Anne-Marie Fox, and Denise Baldwin. And our partners for this series include the Knowledge Translation Unit at the MAP Center for Urban Health Solutions, and the Canada-US Coalition to End Race Correction in Healthcare. Before we get too far into today's session, I want to introduce myself and acknowledge the land. I'm Pat Ocampo. I'm a professor of public health, and I hold a Canada Research Chair in Population Health Intervention Research, and I'm the Executive Director of the Li Kai-shing Knowledge Institute at Unity Health, Toronto. Acknowledging the land on which we now stand and work and live means acknowledging the hundreds of years of colonization of Indigenous peoples all across Canada that continue through today. Acknowledging the land also means reflecting on and engaging in our own journeys of reconciliation with Indigenous communities. Indigenous peoples have experienced ongoing struggles and resistance as they seek to gain respect, recognition, and their rights in the face of ongoing powerful forces of colonization and white supremacy. The sponsor of this speaker series is Unity Health, which is a Catholic hospital, and therefore we must also be reminded of and acknowledge the role that Catholic organizations have had in the colonization process. As far as my own background and journey goes, I'm a descendant of a Japanese mother and a father who is Indigenous North American from south of the Canadian border. Here in Canada, I am a guest on this land and am grateful to have the opportunity to work and live in Toronto, which is a traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Wendat, and recognized most recently as the territory of the Mississaugas of the First Nation. My own reconciliation journey includes working with Indigenous communities and leaders to improve the well-being of Indigenous members of our local communities. A few quick points before we begin. Today's talk is about practices within pulmonology and respirology. These terms are used interchangeably. In Canada, we often refer to specialists as respirologists, and in the US, they tend to use the term pulmonologists. You'll learn from today's talk that a variety of practices within respirology and pulmonology fall into the category of race or ethnic correction, but all are based on the false idea that there are inherent biological differences across races or ethnic groups. These ideas, as we've learned in all the talks in this series so far, are drawing from scientific racism. Errors in pulmonology diagnostic tests that stem from race corrections can impact care received in a variety of other subspecialties, such as cardiology, surgery, oncology, pathology, pediatrics, and more. These race corrections are built into the Thoracic Society guidelines used across North America. A recent study on pulmonology from the US in 2021 found that if race adjustments and corrections were eliminated, the proportion of Black patients who'd receive a diagnosis of a pulmonary defect would rise by 20%. Moreover, if race corrections were eliminated from patients with some type of lung disorder, the proportion of Black patients who'd receive a diagnosis of severe lung disease would rise by 50%. Because these race and ethnic adjustments and corrections are still in use, Black patients are being harmed by being denied care that they need. There are many misconceptions about race adjustments and corrections within pulmonology. The experience with this topic on race correction in lung function testing is different from the previous talks in this series in that we've received several comments already claiming that race correction is not happening within pulmonology at their institution. Yet it's built into the guidelines and other practices within pulmonology. And the Coalition to End Race Correction has never encountered an institution where race correction is not happening around testing for lung function. So I'm hoping that we can begin a much needed discussion about what race correction looks like. As you know, we're eager to hear from you on this topic at these sessions and in between. And thank you to those who've submitted questions about this and about our prior talks. This is a good reminder that we provide background materials to you so that you can learn more and dig deeper into this topic of race and race correction and the specific topics that we present. We provided the links for those of you who want to know more in the Ending Race Correction Speaker Series website. And I think that will appear in the chat. So we're going to have 20 minutes of Q&A after the speakers and panelists present, and you can put your thoughts and reflections and questions into the chat. The chat will be monitored by one of our teams so that we can address them during the Q&A session. And I urge you and thank you in advance for keeping your comments respectful. So I want to move now to the main event of hearing from our panelists and speakers. And we're going to first hear very briefly before the keynote from Dr. Chris Simpson, who is the Executive Vice President and Chief Medical Officer at Ontario Health, the provincial agency for overseeing Ontario's healthcare system. He works clinically as a cardiologist at Kingston Health Sciences Centre and is also an affiliate scientist with the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences at Queen's University. Dr. Simpson, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Pat, and it's a pleasure to be here. Really delighted for the opportunity to speak with you today. As Pat said, I am Chris Simpson. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Ontario Health and also a practicing cardiologist. This is the second time I've spoken at an event organized with the Canada-US Coalition to End Race Correction. The first time I talked about the resistance I experienced in myself when I learned about race correction. I had trouble coming to grips with the fact that I was taught and used practices that harm Black people and communities. I also talked about the fact that as a physician, I'm used to being the authority because as physicians, we're trained to be experts. And we practice medicine with the confidence that we're offering the very best of care for our patients. And like most doctors, I trusted my education. I didn't know that race corrections weren't grounded in scientific evidence, nor did I know that race corrections were often embedded kind of silently in some things like guidelines and other rules and algorithms. But now I know. Race corrections are not at all grounded in scientific evidence. In fact, it's quite the opposite. They're based on false and racist myths, and they are simply harmful. I also know there's no more time for resistance. For those of us who are new to this information, we must be extremely self-aware. If we find ourselves resisting the mountains of evidence, and I invite you to read the dozens of peer-reviewed articles that have been shared along with the invitation to this talk, then we simply have to move through that resistance. Many of us are clinicians, many of you are scientists. It's our work to respond to evidence to serve our communities. And when it comes to race corrections, the evidence is clear. Race correction harms Black people and communities. And this harm has been going on for many, many years. But now together, we're going to change. I am committed to work to address this through Ontario Health's clinical divisions. To prepare for the changes ahead, I encourage you to study the materials shared in advance of this session, attend future sessions, and most importantly, embrace the discomfort that is required to acknowledge these uncomfortable truths. And as we go through this experience together, I do want you to know that you have my support. We will work together to safely and systematically undo these long entrenched practices. I'm very honored to be working with you to end race correction in Ontario's healthcare system, and I have no doubt that Ontario's clinicians and scientists will rise to this challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Simpson. I would like to now turn to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Lindy Braun, who is a professor of Africana Studies and Pathology and Laboratory Medicine at the Albert Medical School of Braun University and a member of the Science, Technology, and Society program. Professor Braun received her PhD from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Her research analyzes the historical role of science in the production of racialized knowledge and racial hierarchies. Her award-winning book, Breathing Race into the Machine: The Surprising Career of the Spirometer from Plantation to Genetics, addresses the history of how racialized knowledge, particularly algorithms, got baked into biomedical research over time. Dr. Braun, turning it over to you.
Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. I thank you very much, Pat, and my sincere thanks go to the members of the End the Practice of Race Correction in Lung Function Testing Committee, especially Dr. Lana James for the invitation to speak to you today. What we think, how we think through pulmonary function tests are actually going to have ramifications, wide ramifications for racism in medicine, particularly in algorithms, but much farther beyond algorithms. I also want to just make a note that there is a lot of behind the scenes work that goes on with these kinds of events, and I want to single out Anne-Marie Fox and Anwar Knight for helping to make the technological and every aspect of the event go smoothly. So I'm really pleased to be here. I'm looking forward to talking to you about the work that I've been doing for more than 2 decades on the history of racism, and lung capacity measurements, in which race correction is embedded. As I'll tell you with the history, racialization of lung capacity is much broader than just race correction. My research has been global in scope, but my talk today will be mostly based on what has happened and is happening in the US. I don't presume to don't presume to speak about the Canadian context. In fact, I invite all my Canadian colleagues to participate in the Q&A at the end about how what I'm saying applies to Canada and what doesn't apply to Canada. I grew up on the Buffalo border, so I'm actually kind of aware of the differences. Let me begin by placing this talk on the history. Let me just see. I don't think my slides are up. Oh, wait. I seem to be getting a whirly ball on my slides. It's still loading. I'm sorry. Well, I'll just tell you what I'm going to do, and hopefully the slides will be loaded. I'll place the talk on the history of race correction and pulmonary function tests in the broader context of recent work on racism in medicine. And this is a global phenomenon, and more particularly algorithms. And I want to ask a very specific question. No, it's not working. The slides aren't. My apologies to everybody. No, the screen's.
Sorry about the technology problems. So as we work behind the scenes to address the technology problems, maybe we can bring on our next speaker. We can bring on Kim so that we can hear from all of our speakers today and not lose any time. And I also want to make sure that Dr. Braun has the time that she needs. So wondering if we can bring on Dr. Connolly, who is the division head of cardiology at St. Michael's Hospital. He's also the executive director of the Keenan Research Center for Biomedical Science. Dr. Connolly is a scientist who's both nationally recognized as an expert in echocardiography, cardiovascular MRI, and the impact of diabetes upon cardiac function and ventricular remodeling. And we thought it would be important to hear from Dr. Connolly as he sees every day the implications of the pulmonology diagnostic tests and some of the errors in lung function that happen as a result of these corrections. Dr. Connolly, welcome.
Thanks, Pat. Greetings, everyone. And again, apologies from us all about the IT issue. Sometimes these things happen. We will get it sorted out. But really what I wanted to do today was to really very formally acknowledge and endorse some of the issues that Dr. Simpson brought up. I'm a cardiologist. And as Pat said, I'm here both representing the Division of Cardiology at St. Michael's Hospital, and I'm also the Executive Director of the Keenan Research Center in Biomedical Science. And so within that, really what I represent is a very large number of groups of persons, scientists, clinicians, staff, students across a whole variety of areas. And what we've seen, and one of the very important things we've seen more recently, is the impact within which these so-called race correction algorithms have started to play within medicine. And although you might argue at the beginning that these were done maybe for the right reasons, I think it's clear, and we're definitely going to hear from our speakers today, Dr. Braun, about how what might and I use that very liberally, have seen a good idea at the time, has then propagated a system that really systematically leads to racism. We're going to hear about the direct impact of what this does in terms of, in fact, of diagnostics and therefore the access to therapeutic strategies there. So really what I want to do today is work with the speakers as well as with the Dr. Simpson, and let everyone know that I've sort of gone through this process of myself of reading and looking at the data and really answering a really important question that I think that Dr. Simpson alluded to. As MDs, we frequently are very good at the question of what. I was taught something, and so we went on and did it. But sometimes I think the exact evidence behind why we've done that has really not necessarily been delved into, thought about it, and considered in the same way. So I know what to do. That is, if I've got a patient that I'm concerned about their lung function, I've gone ahead and ordered the pulmonary function testing. Or it might be, as we've already heard in some of the other race correction series, about the estimate of renal function. But what I haven't necessarily done through my training is ask the question, why? Is this actually based on evidence? Was the reason that this came into play actually for the right scientific reasons? And so I am certainly going through this journey and recognizing that there is no doubt that there is unambiguous harm that the race corrections do to Black people and the communities. And that both in my role as executive director and division head, that we are committed to undergoing a safe and systematic process to de-adopt the race correction. And of course, this is going to be done with the Canada-US Coalition to End Race Correction. And I'm also going through and asking my colleagues to start this process, to start questioning what we are doing. And again, I don't want to do this in a way that is spreading blame. I think what we need to do as mature, thoughtful individuals is ask these questions, go through, look at the reasons why, and then make the right decisions, which is clearly de-adopting these practices. So I want to work with you all, start the conversation and really work to end this unethical, unscientific, and what really is a deeply damaging process. At the end of the day, it probably amounts to the race corrections across a wide variety of areas, really bad clinical practice and bad clinical medicine, and we know that it must stop. And of course, this will ask more questions. What is the correct way then moving forward to address some of the issues that we have as it relates to not the race corrections, but as to the appropriate interpretation of diagnostic tests there. And I'm confident that as we start this dialogue, as we work through it, that we'll appropriately de-adopt and then ask the right questions moving forward, so that we'll do the right thing, which is get the right answers from our diagnostic testing and make certain that folks who are eligible for appropriate therapies get the appropriate therapies, so that in the end, what we do is, of course, improve the outcomes of not only Canadians, of also our Black communities living in Canada, but really people look to Canada as a world leader. So we've got to do this so that we can start to propagate this and have the wide-ranging effects moving forward. And sometimes it's a difficult thing, to go back and look at, you did something with best intentions, but then realizing that in fact this was harmful. So I think we also need to take this opportunity for a deep self-reflection and think about, well, okay, what's done, but what else can we do moving forward to address this? So it's a great lecture. I'm hoping that Dr. Braun, because we've had many discussions about this leading up to this today, so I'm hoping that the IT issues will be sorted out by now. So maybe Pat, back to you, and let's see how we're going there with the IT front. Any luck? Or
I think we're going to try the presentation again.
Excellent. And you'll also note we've got Kristen as our ASL interpreter. Just so you know, her headphones and audio wasn't working, but I can tell that they're working loud and clear now. So thanks again, Kristen, for being patient with us.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Okay, let's try and start again, Dr. Braun.
Okay. I'm still getting the whirly thing on the screen. It's not working. Can I send the slides to, well, you have them. Yeah. Yeah, I'll just start talking and we'll see how it goes. So racism, as many of you know, has a long and persistent history in medicine, and it works in multiple ways. But the subtle ways in which it operates has been largely overlooked, and even in racial disparities research. Only in recent years, really in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in May 2020 by a now convicted police officer and his colleagues, which led to global protests, has there been a more careful elimination of the visible and invisible manifestations of racism. And I think it's important to think about the invisible when we discuss pulmonary function tests. The new attention to racism in the medical world has mostly been student and young faculty driven in the US for about the last 8 years. In 1995, Michel Rolfe-Trouillot wrote a wonderful short history of Haiti entitled Silencing the Past, where he argued that we are never so steeped in the past as when we pretend not to be. And this is, I think, an important point about Trouillot's argument. It's when we pretend not to be. This is ever so true in the case of race correction of pulmonary function tests. Every time we use pulmonary function tests, we are steeped in a history. What then is this past? And does it matter that we know it? A notable example of student and young faculty, a notable example of student and young faculty activism is, of course, the movement to abolish race correction of estimated GFR, with nationwide petitions in the US and activism in Canada. The lab reports for pulmonary function tests are particularly important because they highlight on the report that providers get and that patients get that you need to correct for African Americans. There's nothing so prominent to patients with pulmonary function tests. So that's one way in which the racism is masked in PFTs. Enmeshed in this silence is, of course, the denial of racism in medicine. And this has long been a major issue until very recent years, when everything began to change for societal reasons. Most significantly in the US, that Black and Brown people studying this history have been hired into history departments, sociology departments, anthropology departments, Africana studies departments expanded, as did ethnic studies departments expanded. So before this massive kind of hiring has taken place, and it's more massive in some places than others, there was little known, except that W.E.B. Du Bois, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, wrote a magnificent book, The Philadelphia Negro, and which really says everything that we need to say. I think the point I'm trying to make is we've known for a long time what the problem is, but there's almost no dialogue between humanities, social sciences, and biomedicine, and very little dialogue between lay and expert knowledge systems, which we need. This is what we need in order to recognize and acknowledge how racism actually works. The disconnect is important in producing silence, including in the making of pulmonary function tests. Oh, sorry. I see it's, please stop. Okay.
We're still working on the technology for the slides.
So Pat, feel free to start with question 1 that we have pre-prepared, and then Dr. Lundy's slides are going to try to reload. We're having a little bit of challenge with her internet connectivity for
Okay.
the slide proportion.
That sounds good. All right. I think it involves some logging in and logging out, so that's why we've stopped her talk. But actually, this first question, Lana, is for you. For those of you who don't know Lana, she's the co-founder of the Canada-US Coalition to End Race Correction. So, Lana, we've heard that some of these issues around lung function diagnostics and adjustments and corrections are happening in Canada.
Mhm.
And the US and around the world. And for the perspective of the Canada-US Coalition to End Race Correction, what needs to happen next?
What needs to happen next is, as Dr. Connolly had pointed out, is first of all taking stock and not using that as an opportunity to delay. So a lot of good work has been done, as you've heard and as you will hear from Dr. Lundy, particularly when it comes to pulmonary lung function. This has been with us. It's one of the oldest forms of race correction for 160 years. And so there isn't any more a time to wait, because in that time, a lot of Black lives have been lost and compromised. And so when we talk about introspection, we encourage you to read the resources we provide, take a stock of what your questions are, and most importantly, connect with us. One of the important things that we've done is spent some time, a few years actually, preparing for the process of systematic de-adoption. And de-adoption is the practice of ending a clinical or therapeutic practice that does not have value, has found to be less effective than an existing one, or is known to cause harm. And unfortunately, race correction falls into all 3 of those categories. So the number 1 thing would be to get prepared, read the resources we provided over the last 3 talks. There's several of them. Have your questions, email them, and most importantly, make sure yourself and your institution enrolls. And that's as simple as going to the End Race Correction website, subscribing, and in your email, letting us know that you're interested in participating. Our official enrollment will begin in the new year, but right now we have already onboarded our core participants. And so we encourage people to start that process of letting us know you're ready. And make sure you get those questions out of the way. There's wonderful resources, and we are not starting from the beginning. I like to remind people of that. This has been a long struggle.
You know, some people think it's just a matter of getting educated, Lana, and then knowing that race correction is a problem, and then consciously in your mind trying not to do it anymore. But why do you need a coalition and a process to focus to help de-adoption happen?
Number 1, we have a long history in the practice of medicine and clinical care. When it comes time to make changes, that's very slow to happen systematically. So a review of the literature brings forward that when it comes to ending, de-adopting, or disinvesting from clinical processes, it is a patchwork process. And to this day, a good example of that is antibiotic use, in terms of reforming antibiotic use, because there is not a systematic process in some sites. What we have is a lingering problem that has lasted for decades and caused additional issues. And so when it comes to an issue like race correction, that is lodged in 2 places. One, the broader society that is enveloped with anti-Black racism, and unfortunately, its deep roots and actual sites of genesis in medicine. And so given that this is both a sociocultural problem that plagues the larger society and a clinical issue, we actually have to make sure that we have a systematic process put in place. Why do you need the work of the coalition? Because it's a national piece. In the new census, we have over, I think we're close to 1.6 million folks of the Black and African diaspora across the country. And because race correction happens across the life course and can happen in multiple organ systems as a result of numerous practitioners, laboratory folks, it's really, really important to make sure that all processes that fit into the clinical patient flow and the clinical algorithm are carefully teased out and separated. And what we also know from the literature is that where there is a clear distinction and change of practice, rather than simply a note, we actually have better success with the adoption. And finally, there are many pieces that connect to the clinical practice. That includes access to pharmacare, social work, physical support through rehabilitation services, visiting nurses, and dialysis clinics. There are a myriad of sites that connect in order to have a patient have integrated care. And as we know, Ontario Health is really committed, as are many practitioners, to integrated interdisciplinary care. And that's to ensure that patients, who are people, don't just fall through the cracks of the conveyor belt of healthcare. And so with that in mind, you need a coalition, because we've been doing a lot of planning for years, bringing in all of the different partners and pieces, and most importantly, making sure we're listening to the experiences of Black people who are constantly placed in these positions with clinicians to try to understand what's happening to them and negotiate. So in order to improve the actual clinical outcomes for individual Black folks and at a population health level, there has to be a systematic process that brings all the players who are interdisciplinary across the continuum of care, health services, and policies together, so we have a coordinated response, so it's not a patchwork. And so 5 years from now, we can actually measure where we started to where we finish. And the coalition is engaged in two components. One is the broader initiative and the rollout, and the other piece is the actual research component that evaluates the interventions that we're making to make sure that we can see site by site, region by region, province by province, we have successful de-adoption and implementation. And I think we should have covered most of the pieces. If there's anything I've left out, feel free to ask another question.
Yeah, maybe there's a little bit of an add-on here, because you actually have, you've joined forces with the US. So there's the Canada-US coalition. I mean, aren't things different? Why would we have a combined coalition and not just a Canada coalition?
Oh, well, that's a really good question. And I think one of the things that began with Dr. Lundy's presentation is the point that where the genesis is. And so oftentimes when we think of medicine in Canada, while we are a separate country, we have to remember that the settlement process and the profession of medicine in the Americas has a lot of intertwined roots. And so, as many people may know, and some may not know, Canada and the US were deeply involved in the transatlantic trade, which meant the bringing and kidnapping of African peoples to these shores, and thereby had the same kinds of institutions of slavery and racial segregation. However, they manifested differently because of their different political courses in history. But what wasn't different was how anti-Blackness functioned. So in Canada, we've had formal and informal policies of segregation. We have disproportionate levels of other forms of state violence through increased and unjust higher levels of incarceration. So we see those afterlives of slavery, those institutions, while different across borders and how they appear, the underlying piece is the same. So it's really important for us not to try to pretend that while we are different countries, we share too many of some of the negatives in common. And so one of the opportunities we have, because we're talking about the African diaspora across North America, many of us have kin across those lines. Many of us work across those lines, and most importantly, the institution of how clinical racism and anti-Blackness function have been shared. And many of our colleagues know, who are American and Canadian physicians, they attend the same conferences. The exams are often made and thought through in the same exam bank meetings and sessions, as well as the vast majority of peer-reviewed journals are published in American journals. So we can see how deeply we're intertwined, and the idea that it's different in Canada than the US. I've had many clinicians and physicians tell me that, and unfortunately, the evidence doesn't show us that it's vastly that different. And as you mentioned earlier, some folks have said, oh, we don't have it. And then we're like, okay, let's take a look. And then we find out it might be in their small specific unit or in a particular lab, but it's not across the organization. And wonderfully, because we have a single payer system, we have the opportunity to do a more thorough job. And so we're actually acting as a pilot site for our US partners.
Great, thank you. And I'm gonna rush us off the screen now because I think we have our technology fixed. And so back to you, Dr. Braun.
Okay. I'm unfortunately, I'm not so sure we have the slide showing. So I'm going to just continue talking to the extent I can without the slides. I was making the point when I left for a few moments, is that there's a disconnect between biomedicine, what biomedicine, the kind of biomedical research that is done on health, and the kind of social science and humanities research that is done on health. And there's little interaction between the two. And I think this is illustrated quite nicely on a slide that you'll be able to see later because we'll upload them. But that shows that I first wrote about lung capacity measurements and race in 2005. And there was really virtually nothing, little attention, despite several other articles. In around 2013, I wrote an article for the Canadian Journal of Respirologists, respirology technicians. In 2015, still like pretty much silence in the U.S. And in 2020, there was an article in Chest, and by that time, the whole context had changed. So why did that context change? Well, one of the reasons is that medical algorithms just broke onto the scene when in October 2019, Obermeyer and colleagues published an article in Science, one of the premier, as you all know, premier biomedical journals in the US, about an algorithm produced by a company that guided medical treatment in about 40% of healthcare systems in the US. And this, of course, is where things get quite different in Canada, where healthcare is a right, and it's certainly not in the US. What's interesting about this, nonetheless, and meaningful across borders, is that the algorithm was not explicitly racist. In fact, it didn't mention race, but it directed care to those that use the healthcare system most often. The algorithm developers assumed that Black people use the healthcare system the most, and that but it's just the reverse, that white people use healthcare systems more. So Black people were disadvantaged by this widely used algorithm. So this broke in the press. There were many articles about it, but still it kind of died out until 2020, June 2020, when New England Journal of Medicine published an article that at the point at which racialized algorithms went mainstream in medicine. And the article detailed the specifics of race adjustment of a whole slew of algorithms. With this, medical members of Congress took note, and they ultimately issued a report that you can get on Google, and it's a really important report on racism. They call it the misuse of race in medicine. So when I first wrote my book, and even now, many were surprised to know that the spirometer, one, has a history beyond that of its technical development, and number two, that this history is bound up from the earliest years of its development with white supremacy. And this is not an exaggeration, and as I will mention in a moment. This early racialization, though, continues to the present, as we all struggling with how to go about removing race correction from pulmonary function tests illustrates. Essentially, it's reducing normal in groups other than whites by either a scaling factor, or the other approach is to use population-specific standards. Both are rooted, as Pat has said, in the notion of biological, in really genetic difference, and they're hierarchically organized. The history, though, is of pulmonary function tests or of racialization of lung capacity measurements is a complex one, and it really gained authority by moving between a variety of different fields and playing important roles in debates about emancipation, about war in the UK, throughout the world. This device has kind of moved through anthropometry, through life insurance, and at various from medicine and then back into medicine. So I'm not a physician, and I first learned about race correction when I read an article in the Providence Journal that had been syndicated from the Baltimore Sun because there was a large asbestos case, a legal battle over asbestos eligibility for compensation and how much lung damage former workers had to manifest from asbestos before they could be compensated. This, for a short period of time, hit the press, but it caught my attention for several reasons. I was in a race in medicine workshop. This was back in 1999. I was in a race in medicine workshop, and I was also teaching first-year medical pathology to first-year medical students, and they wanted to know more about racism in medicine. And I had taught a lot about asbestos, and I was a shop steward in a union. So there were a lot of reasons when I saw this article in the Providence Journal that it caught my attention. What particularly caught my attention is that the standards for eligibility for compensation for this occupational disease was different for Black people and for white people. And it just kind of blew my mind that that Black people supposedly had lower lung function normally, and that the dominant explanation for this was innate difference. After my initial surprise, I consulted an occupational medicine friend who assured me that this statement represented conventional thinking in pulmonary medicine, and it was based on a large number of scientific studies, many of which consider Black people to have different trunk sizes than white people, an idea that is still current, but is rooted in the historical period of late 19th and early 20th century scientific racism. My occupational health friend gave me several key studies, and I started reading. Ultimately, I did a systematic review of the literature, all the literature that compared peoples of the world to white people, and the systematic review. It took me years to get it published. It ultimately was published in the European Respiratory Journal, which I was really pleased with. But American journals reviewers in American journals had a really hard time accepting this idea that there was a problem with race correction. Now, one complexity of race correction in compensation is that the issues are completely different when it comes to fitness to work. So the spirometer is also used, as many of you know, to evaluate fitness to work. And there was a lawsuit in New York recently by an Indian American individual who applied to be a firefighter. He was rejected for his lower lung function. And he claimed that this was, in a lawsuit, that this was genetic. But the lawsuit was ultimately unsuccessful. So at first glance, the term race correction seemed very strange to me as a non-physician. When I because I'm in a medical school, because I talked to many physician friends, and everybody had been taught it in medical school. Some remembered it better than others, but everybody had been taught it. So I think this is one argument actually for collaboration between biomedical researchers, clinicians, social scientists, humanities, and lay knowledges. And that has been important to me in thinking through this project. More broadly, though, I've been asking is, what does history allow you to see and to actually reimagine when you're enmeshed in the present? It's very hard to see outside of our current condition. So some of you are well aware of the clinical context and the specific PFTs that are race corrected and those that are not. And you're also aware of the variability that complicates interpretation. What I hope to show in the slide were two different spirometers. One was from my primary physician's office, and it actually had one button for race and one button for sex. So the button for race activated a process of correction for when I went into the spec sheets and looked at it for white and then everybody else in the world. So it was white and non-white. That, obviously seems problematic when we think about it now, but it was the provider had no idea what was in the spec sheets. And that's actually something I found in my interviews throughout in the South Africa, in the UK, and in the US, that very few people, in fact, I don't think anybody knew what types of correction were in, and even whether there was correction in the machine. In fact, when in the UK, the person I was interviewing assured me that they did not use race correction in the UK, and I had to go back to the manufacturer who said, yes, indeed, it's race corrected, and it's race corrected in a different way in the UK, and it is compared to machines that are marketed to the US. The other spirometer that I show on my slide is the one from South Africa, and it was a very small one. The entire mechanism was on a little chip. It was very much more advanced than the one that was in my primary care office. There, the options were different, and so there were 3 different options with a pull-down menu. One, they use the language of Caucasian, which, as I'm sure you're all aware, is a problematic synonym for white, dating to 18th century racial classifications. And then the other 2 options were African and Mexican. And that, when I saw Mexican, I thought, this has to be a US manufacturer, and they're going to market the spirometer to the US, to the Latin America. As it turned out, it was a South African manufacturer, and each of the options standards came from different places. So the white standard was the European coal and steel community, a widely used standard in Europe. And then the African and Mexican came from US NHANES, African American and Mexican American. So this South African manufacturer was indeed hoping to market his new spirometer to Latin America using a Mexican American standards. I think what I want to convey is that there's a mishmash of standards, a variety of standards used now, including now in various units, as Dr. James has mentioned, even within an institution. But the standards used are a variety. Many are still using some quite old standards. And I just want to make the point that race the average lung capacity measurements change quite dramatically over time. Occasionally, race is removed from spirometers, but in this case, it's very, very occasional though, but in this case, white standards then serve as the norm. So the one point I want to make before going on is that there are two methods of race correction: proportionate adjustment or scaling factor, or population-specific standards, based on the notion that populations can be well-defined and that they're genetically different. So this all raises several assumptions about, one, the ordering of humanity into racial groups that's built, that is baked into the spirometer. And there's many conceptual and empirical issues that race correction raises. Most people have just debated the technical dimensions of spirometry and ignored the conceptual, which illustrates the problem of race. But why do we look at spirometry through the lens of race? We certainly don't raise questions of social class when in fact work-related illness affects lung capacity, and this has been illustrated in many people. There's quite good papers showing the impact of social class on lung function measurements. And I think in light of the promotion of the GLI standards, I want to raise, does standardization resolve the issue of race and racism? It might be, race correction might seem fairly straightforward as the click of a button, but it actually erases the complexity and messiness of grouping people. So where did this idea come from, and was there dissent? Interestingly, there was more dissent in the 19th century than in the 20th century. I began tracing the idea in the scientific literature and other historical documents, and we'll give you just a brief glimpse into what I found. As it turned out, the idea of racial difference in lungs dates to Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the US, and a highly influential Enlightenment thinker. So what Jefferson said, and in the book that I'm going to mention, Notes on the State of Virginia, carried a lot of weight. And here in Notes on the State of Virginia, he talked about the pulmonary apparatus in enslaved people being inferior to that of white people. That Black people, in other words, he was saying, differed in the very structure of the pulmonary apparatus. To Jefferson, he recounted, just tons of kinds of differences, but I think it's significant, given his legacy, that the pulmonary apparatus was a defining characteristic of enslaved people that really struck to the heart of their humanity, making them, in his eyes and in the eyes of many of his compatriots at the time, unfit for freedom and citizenship, but very much suited to agricultural labor. So fitness for agricultural labor of enslaved people is a persistent theme in the early literature on lung function. In the 1840s, as I'm sure most of you have heard, the spirometer was first adapted to large populations of people by British physician John Hutchinson, and his work created a lot of interest, both in Europe and across the Atlantic in North America. So in other words, the spirometer quickly went global, and it was picked up, interestingly, by Samuel Cartwright an explicitly pro-slavery Southern plantation physician. And Cartwright had built his own spirometer himself. So this device, this medical device that is still in use, was built by on the plantations of the U.S. South. Jefferson had provided no empirical foundation for his philosophizing. His ideas, thus, may have been consigned to the dustbins of history were it not for Cartwright, who measured and compared lung function in Black enslaved people to white people. His empirical studies gave the notion of Black-white difference now special authority, and he quantified difference is 20%. It was both deficiency and quantified what he claimed to be precisely. One could view certainly Cartwright's ideas of difference as merely a product of the backward South, pre-Civil War South. It's truly repulsive to read his work, and it's the kind of work that you read once and then you read second time to quote, to check your quotes, and then you never look at it again. He was a highly respected physician, though, and he was trained in the North and considered by his peers to be an innovative scientific pioneer. But the racist notions Cartwright was promoting at mid-century, though, were contested by James McCune Smith, the first African-American physician and pharmacist and founder of African-American newspapers. McCune Smith took on the Cartwright's supposedly scientific ideas, and as a staunch abolitionist, he focused on the ideologies and argued that climatic difference accounted for any observed difference by race, that it was not innate. So even in the mid-1800s, there was contestation about this idea of innate difference. Cartwright's racism was, in other words, utterly normal, but viewed by African Americans as racist. Cartwright was working in the tradition of Jefferson, and this is important to remember when we think about the legacy. And his work was given the imprimatur of science in the North a decade later in a very large anthropometric study organized by the esteemed astronomer and Boston patrician Benjamin Apthorpe Gould, who was charged by the U.S. Sanitary Commission during the Civil War to conduct an anthropometric study of Union soldiers. By the end of the Civil War, Black soldiers were allowed into the Union Army. So Gould actually saw that this as a terrific opportunity to conduct extensive anthropometric studies on Black people and white people. The book he published was 600 pages, almost totally filled with tables, all compiled by hand, which is incredible and important to think about. There was great importance given to this work, but one chapter was singled out and devoted to lung capacity measurements. I looked in his archives. I could not find why he decided to feature lung capacity, and one has to think that the idea of difference was really floating around at this time, most likely because of Cartwright. So unlike Cartwright, though, Gould did not link lung capacity explicitly to human potential in his text, and his work appeared sort of race neutral and very modern in a certain sense. And because of that, it has still been cited, at least the last I looked carefully, in 2010 in the New England Journal of Medicine. Gould gave little explanation for differences that he cataloged so exhaustively. And he just presented the numbers and called them facts and let the facts speak for themselves. And because of that, his work is more recognized as science. But his work was fundamentally flawed in the sense that he didn't adjust for height or age or any other factors that could affect lung function, or the life and working conditions of formerly enslaved people in the Union Army, who were treated very differently than white soldiers. He did discuss, though, the importance, and this was really useful to look into the archives. He discussed the messiness of grouping people by race, but then proceeded to do so in this, what is now has become a fairly famous table showing the hierarchy. To make a long story short, Gould's seemingly rigorous scientific method for the caught the attention of none other than Charles Darwin, who included lung capacity together with craniometry as indicators of racial difference in his iconic Descent of Man and Selection in relation to sex that he published in 1871. This obviously enhanced the credibility of this notion of stark difference. And it was picked up soon by Frederick Hoffman, who would go on to be the chief biostatistician of Prudential Life Insurance Company for 40 years. And I also worked in his archives, and his racism is unspeakable, as is his book, Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro, in which he singles out Gould's work and analyzes it in a whole chapter. Hoffman claimed, because he was a German immigrant, that he really understood and could see objectively the US race problem. Again, while the racism in this book makes it unreadable, he too was considered a respectable statistician and a passionate supporter of workers' health, that is, white workers' health. But for Hoffman, Black workers belonged in agricultural spaces, not the better paid factories of the US. Hoffman's work, though, caught the attention of Kelly Miller, the first Black PhD in mathematics in the US, and W.E.B. Du Bois, a sociologist, just polyglot scholar in the US. And they contested sarcastically and fiercely the claims that Hoffman made, because for Hoffman, this meant that Black people were not fit for freedom. He thought they were going to die out, and used lung capacity to prove that. That was a common theme among white intellectuals in the US at that time, in the late 19th century. This early history of race and pulmonary function, thus, was an ugly one, and it has lived on in medicine. By the end of the 19th century, there was enthusiasm for the spirometer as a technologically innovative instrument with many applications, and the idea of innate difference in lung capacity between Black people and white people was circulating widely. It was marshaled in hotly contested societal debates over emancipation, and in both explicitly and more muted scientific ways, it was acquiring a scientific evidence base. Importantly and significantly, this notion of racial difference became science by the turn of the 20th century. This early history is a US phenomenon, shaped fundamentally by the US history of slavery and white supremacy. The question we must ask ourselves is this history a thing of the past, or does it live on hidden in many race-based practices, such as race correction, where it can be difficult to see. And I think just the fact that, as Dr. James was mentioning earlier, that that many people think that spirometers don't race correct, but in fact, when you dig deep, race correction is happening, shows just how difficult to see it is. So mostly when you encounter pretty vicious racism, people will say, oh, but we don't do that anymore. And yet here we see the legacy living on. I should note that only Gould, not Hoffman or Cartwright's more strident narratives are cited in the future in this scientific literature in the 20th and 21st century. In the second decade of the 1900s US, at a moment when scientific racism, as captured in eugenic theories and policies rooted in hereditarianism, flourished, a flurry of scientific articles were published on race and lung function, first in the US, then in China and India. So again, this technology and what it carried was global at many moments. Further, it spread through China and India, further supported and entrenched what was a widespread view about racial difference. Indeed, by the end of the 1920s, difference was by and large explained with more scientific backing as innate. For example, an article published in 1922, and you'll see this on this one of the slides when you get a chance to look at them, in the Journal of American Medical Association, speculated that difference could be due to a possible racial factor. Over time, this possible racial factor became genetics. There was no understanding of genetics at that moment. While doing historical scholarship and engaging in the theoretical debates about race, quantitative knowledge, eugenics, I was encouraged to look systematically at the scientific literature by my colleague Kay Dickerson, a masterful systematic reviewer at Johns Hopkins, to look at the evidence base for this idea more systematically. I had no idea what I was getting into. If any of you have done systematic reviews, you know they're quite onerous, but I found many different perspectives that I had not anticipated prior to this collaboration. There were just three simple questions that guided our systematic review. How is race defined by researchers over time? How is racial difference explained over time? And did they include social class over time? And lest I forget, when we submitted the first version of this paper to PLOS Medicine, the editor returned it and asked, it said this was opinion because it was historical. So it had no credibility as a scientific article. We could write an opinion piece if we wanted to. We didn't want to write just an opinion piece. We wanted to actually show the data. After the key decade of the 1920s, comparative studies diminished in the US, although there were some in the 1930s and 40s in India and China. Indians, in India, the Indian researchers gave social explanations for difference, whereas the missionaries, the US missionaries, gave innate difference as explanations. In the 1960s, this comparative kind of research spread much more widely across the globe, from the US to South Africa to the UK to China and to India. And the most highly cited remain those studying individuals determined to be Black, whether in the US or South Africa. And the US and South Africa had particular authority because they could do comparative studies in their respective countries. The majority of the studies continued to come from the US. How did they define race? 83% of the studies did not define race in their methodology. 83%. So these are all selected on the basis of being studies that compare racial differences, but they didn't define race. And even those that did define race, we gave credit for kind of any attempt to defining race. Even those that did define race, it was all over the place. So there's certainly no understanding of really the fundamental, what they were studying fundamentally. So his interest in spirometry mushroomed in the 1960s and continued its global track. Explanations for difference certainly expanded beyond a racial factor, but it was just the studies I examined were just a litany of, or a laundry list really, of various kinds of things such as respiratory infection, tobacco smoke, pollution, climate. They weren't studied. They were just mentioned as possible factors. So it was this context in the 60s that really led to a codification of innate difference in a racial correction factor in 1974. And this was the product of a study by Charles Rossiter and Hans Weil. Rossiter was from the UK and Weil was from New Orleans. And they did a study of asbestos workers in Louisiana, Black asbestos workers and white asbestos workers in the same factory. And they came up with a difference of 13.2% for Black individuals on the basis of this. Really, to me, seems like a small sample size. It is something like 200. And they dismissed, as they were promoting this correction factor of 13.2%, they were also dismissing social and environmental conditions. So the two things are linked quite clearly in this important paper. And incredibly, we're still living with this scaling factor. There were and continue to be, I'm going to start to wrap up. So there were and continue to be endless technical debates about whether the scaling factor was accurate, and there were debates about other technical feature of spirometry, but no attention was paid to the various meanings of Black worldwide. For example, apartheid categories in South Africa might differ from changing US census categories in the US, or to the living and working conditions of Black individuals. There was just simply no attention to living and working conditions. Blackness was simply assumed to reflect deep biological difference. So well into the 20th century, we see a continuous lack of questioning. And this, and really the first two researchers to contest this idea of a racial factor actually came from South Africa, and two white clinicians, one a pulmonologist, a respirologist, and one an occupational physician, actively involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. And they looked, because of the context of the US, they looked at everything quite differently and argued for a universal standard, not corrected factors. So both Du Bois and Miller and Myers and Neil White point to the importance of context and even being able to imagine certain questions. Are we at a different context right now? I think yes. So perhaps we can begin to ask different questions about race correction to eliminate it. Neil White actually worked in Canada for several years. So in fact, this lack of contestation of the practice illustrates just how normal looking at spirometry through the lens of race was, and why the notion persisted, and how formidable an evidence base was constructed over the years in the absence of questioning. The papers are published in the top medical journals, not all, but many. And so this database is really stunning, and it has been built on. And I'll just sort of begin my conclusion by pointing out this New England Journal of Medicine paper published in 2010 that shows how newer genomic technologies such as AIMS build on and consolidate rather than challenge the race-based model. And they cite 19th century literature as evidence for continuing to think in terms of a race-based model. So Gould was cited in this New England Journal of Medicine paper. So this long history has not been contested very, very often until recently. The ideas are, and I have a little triangle, a slide with a triangle just showing the hierarchy. And I think that triangle will stick in your minds, that the ideas of a hierarchical difference are what has persisted, a hierarchical and innate to the present, gaining more credibility through more thorough and sophisticated scientific investigations, improved instrumentation, and more sophisticated statistics. This is our legacy. As you reflect on this history, it's useful to keep in mind this hierarchical structure. And I have to say, I lost a student working with me who said, on the systematic review, I think there is difference. And what helped me was that if we see a hierarchy, we should have pause. So beyond the specifics of the spirometer, though, this history illustrates that the questions we ask, the methods we use, the arguments we make, all are shaped profoundly by the social context. And the US is a highly racialized context, and I would say so is that of Canada, of Europe, South Africa, etc. Thank you very much, and I apologize for the probably my technical problems, I have to say. I don't know what happened, but I'm sorry.
Thank you so much, Dr. Braun. Really appreciate your being able to continue without the slides. And I think it was really a shared challenge that we experienced. We learned so much from your knowledge, expertise, and how you've been steeped in this literature. I do also want to apologize to the audience. Do send your questions in, because maybe we can host a special Q&A with the respirologist to get some of your questions answered. And then stay tuned for the talks that we're going to be having next year. But Dr. Braun, if you don't mind, we constantly get this question about GLIs, or the Global Lung Function Initiative. And there's a perception that that is not, I guess, not based on this notion of biological race or biological ethnicity. And I'm wondering if you can comment on that, because there's a perception that using GLIs means we're not doing any kind of race or ethnic corrections or adjustments.
Okay, so I get that all the time too in the US, even though many places haven't adopted GLI yet, they are discussing the adoption. When I looked at the fundamental paper on which this is based, the standards for in the US are NHANES standards, which are racial standards. They are the
Okay.
ones that they're African American, they're what they call Caucasian, and they are Mexican American. Now there's some kind of fudging happening of combining Mexican Americans with white people because there's no difference. So that's kind of really interesting to me, but um, nonetheless, the standards remain NHANES. None, the point to me is how are populations defined?
Yeah.
And I've written a paper about this a long time ago, actually. But I think the question is, where did those standards come from? How did they define them?
Yes, thank you. I mean, that was my takeaway too from what you said. You put it fairly simply. How is race defined? How are we explaining these differences? And those explanations over and over again in medicine and in my field, public health, boiled down to there are genetic differences or biological differences or some kind of inherent differences, which we know is not true. From a theoretical standpoint, and in fact is derived from scientific racism.
Exactly.
So I think we've run out of time. Again, I can't thank you enough, and thank you for your patience with our technological challenges, and thank you for sharing your wisdom. As for the audience, just want you to know that we will be making the slides available probably as a link on our website, and do send us your questions. And we'll get you the answers to the questions as soon as we can. Thank you all for your patience.
I'm sure the mistake is mine, so I don't think it's my apology to make.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, please, Lana.
I want to take the opportunity also to thank Dr. Lindy Braun expressly. She was kind enough when I reached out to her in 2018 to share a lot of the information that she shared with you and a lot of the institutional and larger memory about the discussions and the field that we don't see written about in articles. And she spent many hours. We've shared articles and discussions, and her level of supportiveness has allowed me in working to develop a plan with the team that you see and many that you do not see to be as effective as it is. Because at an issue that's been with us for 160 years in various forms, you need to make sure that you look into working and finding the knowledge of people who have been around for a minute and who have collaborated for a long time. So I want to expressly thank Dr. Lindy Braun for the time she spent with me and with the broader Canada-US Coalition to End Race Correction. And I'm looking forward to her continued work with us. And I really encourage for all of the clinicians and researchers who have not read that book, it's really important because often folks want to keep returning to the question of, well, is there not some value in addressing race? And if you want to look at the issues around policy, practice, environmental exposures that are racialized, then that is a different type of research than what we're talking about measuring folks' lungs. Because for those of us who have done cadaver sciences, we know that there are not Black lungs and Chinese lungs and Burmese lungs, and we have lungs. And that's what's important, especially when we have strange definitions of race, such as African American, or categorizing people according to their melanation. And we know from our talk from Andrea and Dr. Graves that, in fact, melanation, perceptions of race do not map directly onto the categories that we have socioculturally defined. And so I want to thank you again, Dr. Lindy Braun, for your amazing research and that book that brought together over 160 years of scientific racism. And I look forward to other folks reading it. And as Pat said, please send us your questions and we will organize to get you answers and likely hold a separate session that's specifically for clinicians that we've been discussing for a little while. Thanks again and have a wonderful day. And thanks to our entire team and all of our attendees.